The train didn't slow gracefully into Harlan Station. It ground to a stop like something wounded, metal shrieking against metal, steam hissing out in great exhausted clouds that swallowed the platform whole. Evelyn Hart pressed her face to the cold glass of the window and tried to see what waited for her on the other side of all that white. Montana in late October looked like a place that had given up on color. The sky sat low and colorless, pressing down on a landscape of frozen brown grass and scattered pine that stretched in every direction without apology or end. There were mountains somewhere behind the overcast. She could sense their weight, even if she couldn't see them. But everything else was flat and pale and silent in a way that made her feel very small and very far from anything she had ever known. She was 31 years old. She had sold her mother's sewing machine to pay for the train ticket. She had packed 2 dresses, 1 pair of boots that were already worn at the heel, a winter coat that wasn't warm enough, and a secret that felt heavier than all of it combined. Evelyn picked up her bag from the overhead shelf, straightened her coat, and walked to the end of the car. The platform was nearly empty. A station master in a heavy wool cap moved down the length of the train, checking something on a clipboard. 2 men in work clothes loaded crates onto a wagon without looking up. A woman with a baby on her hip stood near the station door, watching Evelyn with the flat, measuring gaze of someone who had learned to read strangers quickly and trusted none of them. Evelyn looked for a man she had never met. She had only a photograph. Small, slightly blurred, taken in bright outdoor light that washed out half the detail. A man standing in front of a fence line, squinting into the sun, broad through the shoulders, a hat pulled low. 3 children arranged in front of him with the stiff posture of people who had been told to hold still. She had studied that photograph so many times in the weeks since the letter arrived that she could reconstruct it from memory. The middle child's untucked shirt, the youngest girl clutching the hem of the tallest one's dress, the man's hands resting on his thighs, as if he wasn't quite sure what else to do with them. She didn't see him on the platform. She walked to the end of it and looked out at the dirt road that led from the station toward town. A wagon was pulled up at the far end, a single horse standing motionless in the cold. A man sat on the bench seat, forearms resting on his knees, not moving. He wasn't watching the train. He was watching the ground in front of his horse's feet. Evelyn walked toward him. He looked up when she was about 10 feet away, and she recognized the set of his jaw from the photograph, even if the rest of him was harder and older than she had expected. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired under a battered hat, with lines around his eyes that didn't come from smiling. He studied her the way a man might study a horse he was considering buying. Not unkindly exactly, but without pretending the examination wasn't happening. "Miss Hart," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Thornton." He climbed down from the wagon. He was taller than she'd gauged from sitting, and he moved with the careful economy of someone whose body had learned to conserve itself against hard work and cold. He held out a hand and she shook it. His grip was brief and firm. "Train was late," he said. "About 40 minutes. There was trouble with the engine outside of Billings." He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected about the day. He took her bag from her before she could protest and set it in the back of the wagon without comment. "Children are at the ranch," he said, climbing back up. "Margaret's watching them. She's our neighbor. Lives about 3 miles east. She helps out when she can." Evelyn climbed up on the other side. The bench was hard, and the wind off the flats cut right through her coat. She pressed her hands between her knees and said nothing. They rode in silence for the first mile. The town of Harlan was not much. A main street with a general store, a feed supplier, a small hotel that looked like it hadn't repainted since the previous decade, a doctor's office, and a saloon that was doing livelier business than any of the other establishments despite the hour. Caleb Thornton drove through it without stopping or looking at much of anything, and Evelyn watched it pass and told herself this was fine. She had not come here expecting a city. Past the edge of town, the road turned to frozen ruts, and the wagon bumped and jolted over them. The sky had gotten darker in the time since she'd stepped off the train, which seemed impossible given how early it still was. She looked up and understood. The cloud cover was thickening. The air smelled like snow. "Does it snow often this early?" she asked. Caleb glanced at the sky the way she imagined he glanced at most things. Briefly, accurately, without sentiment. "Already snowed once. 3 weeks ago. This one'll stick." She nodded. She was from Ohio, where winter came in gradually, where there were usually a few polite weeks of warning. This did not appear to be a place that offered warnings. They rode on. "My children," Caleb said eventually, and stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words the way a man might choose footing on uncertain ground. Claire's the oldest. She's 12. She's been running the house since her mother passed. She won't be easy." "I wouldn't expect her to be." He glanced at her sideways. "Thomas is 9. He's been sick on and off since summer. Nothing the doctor can name, just he runs low and then he runs a fever and then he runs low again. He's better than he was." "I'm sorry to hear that." "And Nora's 6. Something shifted in his jaw when he said the youngest child's name, just slightly. She'll be fine. She takes to people." Evelyn heard what he wasn't saying. The oldest will be hard. The middle one is fragile. The youngest one is the easy part, and he knows it. She filed all of this away carefully. "Mr. Thornton," she said, "I know this is an unusual arrangement. I know there are things we haven't talked about that we probably should. I just want you to know that I'm not coming here with expectations I haven't earned." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon horse picked her way through a frozen rut, and he let her work it out without pulling on the reins. "You came a long way," he said. "I did." "Why?" She had thought about how she might answer this question. She had prepared several versions of the truth, arranged them in order from safest to most honest. She said, "Because I wanted something real, and I thought this might be it." Caleb Thornton said nothing to that. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. But he didn't dismiss it either, and she supposed that was something. But the ranch appeared out of the gray afternoon like something that had always been there and would still be there long after everyone currently living in it was gone. It was bigger than she'd imagined. A main house of weathered timber, a large barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, several outbuildings in various states of repair. A fence line ran back into the property as far as she could see, post after post disappearing into the brown distance. There were cattle somewhere. She could hear them. A low, collective murmur carried on the wind, though she couldn't see them yet. The house itself was not beautiful, but it was solid. That was what she thought first. Solid and deliberate, and built by someone who cared whether it lasted. A woman came out of the front door before the wagon had fully stopped. Heavy-set, 60s, with white hair and a sharp face that currently wore an expression of frank appraisal. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked right up to the side of the wagon. "Well," she said, looking at Evelyn, "you're thinner than I expected." "Margaret?" Caleb said, just making an observation. But her eyes were not unkind. She offered Evelyn a hand to help her down from the wagon. Her grip was like iron. "Margaret Hale. I live east of here. I've been keeping an eye on these children since their mother died, so you should know that I'll be paying attention." "I'd expect nothing less," Evelyn said. Margaret looked at her a beat longer, then gave one nod, as if something had been decided. "Come inside, it's cold and supper's nearly ready." The front door opened into a main room that served as both parlor and kitchen, with a large fireplace on the east wall and a long table in the center. It was warm inside, which was the first thing Evelyn registered, and then she registered the 3 children standing in a line near the fireplace with the distinct air of people who had been told to stand there and weren't happy about it. Clara was tall for 12, with her father's dark hair and eyes that were measuring and flat. She had her mother's apron tied around her waist. Evelyn could only assume it had been her mother's. And she was holding a dish towel like a person who had gotten very used to being in charge of this kitchen and was watching to see whether she was about to lose it. Thomas stood beside her, slightly shorter, slightly thin in the way of a child who had been sick and hadn't fully recovered the weight. He watched Evelyn with an expression that was more curious than guarded. Still cautious, but something in him seemed genuinely interested in who she was. And then there was Nora. Nora was 6 years old and small for her age, with a halo of brown curls that hadn't been brushed quite thoroughly enough, and 2 front teeth that were in the process of growing back in. She stared at Evelyn with enormous dark eyes, and then, without any hesitation whatsoever, walked directly across the room and held out her hand. "I'm Nora," she said. "I'm 6. My middle name is Jane. Do you like horses?" Evelyn crouched down and took the small offered hand very seriously. "I do like horses. My name is Evelyn. I don't have a middle name I'm particularly fond of, so we can skip that part." "And how old did you say you were?" Nora's eyes went wide. I just said 6. Right, 6. I should have been paying better attention. Nora nodded gravely, apparently satisfied with this admission. Then she looked Evelyn directly in the face and said, with the complete sincerity of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned to be diplomatic, "Are you going to be our new mother?" The silence that followed had edges. Evelyn felt Clara go still across the room. She didn't look up at Caleb Thornton, but she was aware of him in her peripheral vision, aware of him not moving, not speaking. She kept her eyes on Nora. "I'm going to be your father's wife," she said carefully. "What that means for the rest of it, we'll figure that out together. Does that seem fair?" Nora thought about this with visible effort. "Okay," she said finally, "but you can sit next to me at supper." "I'd like that." Supper was Margaret's cooking. A venison stew that was genuinely good and a pan of cornbread that was somewhat less so, and it was not comfortable. Caleb sat at the head of the table and ate with the focused efficiency of a man who ate to maintain function rather than for pleasure. Clara served and ate in silence, watching Evelyn from beneath her lashes with an expression that gave nothing away. Thomas asked Evelyn 2 questions about Ohio, whether it was true that there were big cities and whether she had been to one, and seemed pleased by her answers, though he didn't press further. Nora talked nearly without pause about a horse named Biscuit, who she was not technically allowed to ride, but had sat on once when her father wasn't looking. "I know about Biscuit," Caleb said, without looking up from his stew. Nora went quiet for approximately 10 seconds. Then she asked Evelyn if she wanted more cornbread. After the children had gone to bed, Nora under mild protest, Thomas willingly, Clara with the quiet efficiency of someone who needed no supervision, Caleb and Evelyn sat at the table with the remains of supper between them and the fire going low and the weight of everything unsaid pressing down like the clouds outside. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, "because I don't have a lot of patience for things going wrong because of things left unsaid." "All right," Evelyn said. "I placed that advertisement because I needed help. Not company, not—" He seemed to pick his way through this carefully. "The children need a woman in the house, someone consistent, someone who can teach them and keep things going. This ranch takes everything I have. I can't do all of it." "I understand that." Clara's been carrying more than a 12-year-old should have to carry for the past year and a half. "I could see that." He looked at her directly for the first time since they'd sat down. "I'm going to need to know about you. The letter you sent. You were careful about what you included." Evelyn folded her hands around the coffee cup. She had known this was coming. She had been knowing it was coming since she bought the train ticket. She had told herself a dozen times on the train that she would tell him when the time was right, that she would find the right moment, that she would explain it properly so that he would understand. She had not imagined that she would do it this way. Tired and cold, and with stew going stiff on the table between them, and the weight of everything she was hoping for pressing down on her chest. But she was also beginning to understand that there was never going to be a right moment. There was just this moment, and the next one, and the decision she made between them. "I can't have children," she said. "I couldn't before, and I can't now. There was an illness several years ago, and after it, I was told very plainly that it wasn't going to be possible." She kept her voice even. She had practiced keeping her voice even when she said these words, because the alternative was something she didn't want to do in front of this man she barely knew. "I should have told you in the letter, I know that. I made a choice not to, and I'm not going to make excuses for it, except to say that I was afraid of what you'd do with the information before you'd had a chance to know anything else about me." Caleb sat very still. The fire popped and shifted. Outside, the first snow of what would turn out to be a very long winter had begun to fall, quietly, without announcement, as if it had simply always been there and they hadn't noticed. "You came here under false pretenses," he said. "I came here because I wanted to be honest in person rather than dismissed by mail. That's not your decision to make." "No," she said. "You're right. It wasn't." Another silence, longer this time. "I have 3 children," Caleb said. "I don't need—" He stopped, started again. The advertisement was for a wife, a partner, someone who could help build what this ranch is supposed to be. If I wanted someone just to cook and clean, I'm not just offering to cook and clean. Then what are you offering? Evelyn looked at him steadily. Exactly what it says. To be here. To work. To take care of your children. To learn what this land needs and do it. I'm not going to pretend I know everything about ranching, because I don't. But I'm not afraid of work, and I'm not fragile, and I don't need things to be comfortable before I can function. You're describing hired help. I'm describing a woman who came 2,000 miles in an act of faith and is asking you not to put her back on a train tonight. The quiet that followed that was different in quality from the ones before it. Less adversarial. More like two people standing at the edge of something and looking down. Caleb got up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there, looking out at nothing, or looking at the snow which was falling more steadily now, visible through the glass in the light from inside. He stood there for a while. Then he said, without turning around, "There's a room off the kitchen. It's small. You can sleep there." He paused. "When spring comes, if this isn't working, if you're not, you'll need to leave. That's the deal I can offer." Evelyn set down her coffee cup. "I understand." He turned around. He looked at her like he was trying to determine something he couldn't quite get a read on. "You're not going to argue?" "No." "Why not?" "Because you're not wrong," she said, "and because I think I can prove more than I can argue. So I'll take the room, and I'll do the work, and we'll see what spring looks like." Something moved through his expression that she couldn't name. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. "Good night, Miss Hart," he said. "Good night, Mr. Thornton." He went out to check the barn, as he apparently did every night regardless of the weather, and Evelyn sat alone at the table for a few minutes before she got up and cleared the dishes. The room off the kitchen was small in the way that rooms in working houses are small. Not cruel, just minimal. A narrow bed with a wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar, a wooden chest of drawers with a small mirror hung above it, a single window that looked out on the side yard, and beyond that the dark shape of the barn, a hook on the wall for her coat. She unpacked her bag by the light of a single lamp, hanging her dresses on the hook and placing her other things in the top drawer of the chest. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat on her thighs and took a long breath. She was here. That part had worked. What happened next was less certain. She lay down on top of the blanket without undressing, because the room was cold enough that she wanted the extra layer, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her. She could hear the wind picking up outside. She could hear, very faintly, the sound of one of the children moving around upstairs. Someone getting up for water, probably, or unable to sleep. She lay still and listened to the house and tried to get a sense of its rhythms. After a while, she heard Caleb come back from the barn. She heard him take off his boots in the entryway, heard him move through the kitchen, heard him climb the stairs. She heard the sound of his door at the end of the hall. Then the house was quiet. She thought about Clara, who had gone to bed without saying a single word to her. She thought about Thomas, who had asked 2 careful questions and listened to the answers with real attention. She thought about Nora, who had simply walked across the room and introduced herself as if the situation were perfectly normal, as if the presence of this strange woman was not strange at all. She thought about the cold and the snow and miles of frozen grass that surrounded this place on every side. She thought, I have until spring. That was not much time, but it was something. She had spent a long time, longer than she cared to count, believing that there was no place in the world where she would fit, that the thing that was wrong with her had removed her from the category of women who got to have families, who got to be needed, who got to belong somewhere. She had watched other women with their children and felt the absence in herself like a physical weight, like something that had been taken out and left a hollow. She was not going to let herself believe, not yet, that this could be the place. That would be foolish, and she had learned to be careful about hope. But she could work. She had always been able to work. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the work led somewhere the hoping hadn't. She closed her eyes. Outside, the snow kept falling, the way it would go on falling all winter, patient and indifferent and absolutely certain of itself. She was up before dawn, not because she'd slept well, she hadn't, but because she had noticed the previous evening that the kitchen fire had been banked and left, which meant that whoever built it in the morning was waking up to a cold stove, and she thought she might as well be the one to fix that. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair back without looking too hard in the mirror, and went into the kitchen. It was dark outside the windows. The snow had stopped during the night, and the yard was covered in a clean 2 inches of white that reflected the faint coming gray of the sky. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at it. Then she found the firewood and the kindling where they'd been left beside the stove, and she built the fire. She was not expert at this. In Ohio, she'd had a different kind of stove, and she understood this one was going to take some learning. She got it going eventually, imperfectly. The smoke backed up briefly before the flue cleared, and she had to open the back door for a moment, letting in a blast of cold that made her catch her breath. But it caught. She got it going. She found coffee in a tin on the shelf, measured it out the way her mother had taught her, set the pot to heat. She found flour and lard and thought about biscuits, then second-guessed herself, then decided that second-guessing herself was not a good strategy and made the biscuits anyway. She was cutting them out when she heard small feet on the stairs. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, her curls completely out of control, blinking at the light and the warmth. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at the biscuits. "You made breakfast," she said. "I did. Papa usually makes breakfast. I woke up early." Nora considered this with the gravity of a small person working through the implications. "Okay," she said, and climbed up onto one of the chairs at the table and put her chin in her hands. "What are those?" "Biscuits. Like what Margaret makes?" "Probably not exactly like what Margaret makes. Margaret seems like she's been making biscuits longer than I have." Nora nodded. This seemed reasonable to her. "Can I have one anyway?" "When they come out of the oven. 10 minutes. Nora accepted this timeline. She sat at the table and watched Evelyn with the uncomplicated attention of a child who had not yet learned that watching people was something you were supposed to be subtle about. "Where's Ohio?" she asked. "East. A long way east. If you went from here all the way to where the sun comes up in the morning and kept going, you'd eventually hit Ohio." Nora's eyes went wide. "Did you ride a horse the whole way?" "I took the train." "Oh." She seemed to weigh this. "I've never been on a train." "They're loud," Evelyn said, "and they shake. And it takes a very long time. But you get to watch everything go by out the window." "What did you see?" "Rivers. A lot of flat land. Some mountains that weren't as big as yours. Horses and fields. Towns that looked like they'd grown up too fast." Nora had her chin propped on both fists now. "Did you leave anyone behind?" Evelyn paused in her biscuit cutting. "What do you mean?" "In Ohio, did you leave someone behind, like a family?" She resumed cutting. "No, I didn't have anyone left in Ohio. That's part of why I came." Nora seemed to think this was both sad and reasonable. "I lost my mother," she said matter-of-factly, with the particular matter-of-factness of a child who has processed something in ways adults often fail to recognize as processing. "She got sick in the winter. Then she was gone." "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "I'm very sorry." "Papa cried," Nora said. "He thinks we didn't see, but we did. Clara cried too, but she did it in her room so we wouldn't know." Evelyn said nothing. "Do you think you could stay?" Nora asked. It was such a plain question, asked with such plain directness, that for a moment Evelyn didn't know what to do with it. She thought of the conversation last night. She thought of Caleb Thornton standing at the window and saying when spring comes. "I'm going to try my very best," she said. Nora seemed to accept this. She sat quietly for a moment and then said, "The biscuits smell good." "Let's hope they taste as good as they smell." Nora grinned at her, a wide, gap-toothed grin that arrived without any warning and then just sat there on her face, guileless and complete. "Margaret's biscuits are better, but I won't tell you what she does different." "That's probably wise," Evelyn said. Caleb came downstairs at first light and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he smelled the coffee. He looked at Evelyn at the stove, and at Nora at the table, and at the biscuits sitting on the pan, and something moved across his face that was too quick and too guarded for her to read. He said, "You didn't need to do that." "I was up," she said. "Coffee's ready." He came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup and stood by the stove, which was the warmest place in the room, and drank it standing up. Nora chattered at him about something she'd dreamed, and he listened with the particular listening of a tired man who is still fully present for his children even when he's tired, and Evelyn noted this and filed it away. Thomas came down next, quiet and a little pale, and sat beside Nora, and ate his breakfast without much appetite. Clara came last. She stopped when she saw Evelyn had made the food, and something crossed her face. Not quite anger, not quite hurt, something more complicated than either. And then she sat down and ate without looking at anyone. When she had finished, she picked up her plate and took it to the wash basin and said, without turning around, "You put too much lard in the biscuits." Evelyn said, "You're probably right." Clara turned around then. She hadn't expected that. She looked at Evelyn for a moment with her dark, measuring eyes, and then she took her plate back to the table and ate the second biscuit she'd been saving. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to that. But it was something. Ichant. The first week unfolded the way the land itself seemed to unfold, without drama, without softness, just the next thing after the next thing after the next thing. She learned the stove. She learned where things were kept. She learned that Thomas needed his breakfast brought to him when he was having a difficult morning, not offered, but quietly placed, because he didn't like to ask. She learned that Nora would attempt to follow her everywhere unless given a specific task, and that the tasks had to be real ones, not invented busy work, because Nora at 6 already had an unerring instinct for being condescended to. She learned that Clara had reorganized the kitchen after her mother died, and that every single thing in it had a place, and that if you moved something without asking, you would know about it by the look you received. She learned that Caleb Thornton was out of the house before she was awake most mornings, and often not back until after dark, and that the ranch hand he employed, a weathered man named Pete, who was around 50 and spoke in complete sentences approximately twice a day, was in the barn most of the time she was in the house. She learned the shape of the cold, which was different out here than anything she had known. It wasn't just temperature. It had weight and intention. It came through walls. It came under doors. You couldn't ignore it. You had to work around it and inside of it, plan for it, fight it constantly, in small domestic ways. The fire, the drafts, the way the water in the pump stiffened if you didn't run it often enough. She learned all of this in a week. On the 7th day, the snow came again. This time it wasn't polite. It came down hard, starting in the afternoon and going through the night. And by morning, the world outside the windows was buried to the second fence rail and still coming down. Caleb had gone out before first light with Pete to check on the cattle, and Evelyn had seen them from the kitchen window, two dark shapes moving through the white toward the barn, heads down against the wind. That morning, Thomas didn't come down to breakfast. She went up to check on him. He was in his bed with the blankets pulled to his chin, and his face was flushed in a way that made her stomach go cold. She put the back of her hand against his forehead and felt the heat radiating off him. "How long have you felt like this?" she asked. "Since last night," he admitted. He sounded ashamed. "I didn't want to say anything." "Why not?" He looked at the ceiling. "Because Papa worries." She sat on the edge of his bed. "I know," she said. "But right now the person you need to tell is me, and I'm not going to worry. I'm going to get you some water and some broth and a cold cloth for your head. All right?" He looked at her with those careful 9-year-old eyes. "Are you going to get the doctor?" "Let's see how you do today first." She spent most of that day between the kitchen and his room. She kept the fire in his room going and made broth from the ham bone she'd found in the cold box and kept the cloth on his forehead cool. Clara appeared in the doorway of his room mid-morning, took in the scene, and without a word went and got a fresh bowl of water without being asked. They worked around each other in that room without talking much, and it was the first time Evelyn had a sense that something might, eventually, be possible with this girl. By evening, Thomas's fever had broken enough that he could eat a little. He sat up against his pillow and took the broth and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was trying to be careful and failing. "Thank you," he said. "Of course." "Clara said you stayed up here most of the day." "There was nowhere I needed to be more." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to sit with me when I was sick," he said. "She'd read to me." He stopped. I'm not saying—" "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm not trying to be her." He looked at her. "What are you trying to be?" She thought about it honestly. "Useful," she said. "And here. That's enough for now." Thomas considered that for a moment. Then he said, "Would you read to me if you're staying up here anyway?" She found a book on his shelf. An adventure story, clearly well read, the spine creased from many openings, and she sat in the chair by his bed and read until he fell asleep. Caleb came home after dark, stamping snow off his boots in the entryway, and found Clara at the table with her schoolwork and Nora asleep on the settee with a cat he hadn't realized they had apparently claimed. He looked around the kitchen. Something was simmering on the stove. "Where's—" "Upstairs," Clara said without looking up from her work. "Thomas had a fever. She's been up there most of the day." He was halfway up the stairs before he realized he'd moved. He stopped in the doorway of Thomas's room. Evelyn was sitting in the chair beside the bed, the book open on her lap, her head tilted back against the chair back. She wasn't asleep, but she'd clearly been on the edge of it. She straightened when she heard him and looked up. Thomas was asleep, his color better than it had been in days, his breathing even. Caleb looked at his son. Then he looked at Evelyn. She stood up carefully so as not to wake Thomas and came out into the hall, pulling the door most of the way closed behind her. She was quieter than he expected for someone who'd been sitting in a chair all day. She looked tired. "His fever broke this afternoon," she said. "He ate some broth tonight. I think he'll be all right, but I want to watch him through tomorrow." Caleb said nothing. She looked up at him. "I should have told you immediately. I'm sorry. By the time I knew how bad it was, the weather—" "You handled it," he said. She stopped. "I'm not—" He looked away, looked back. Something in him was moving that he wasn't entirely sure what to do with. "You didn't have to stay up there all day." "Yes, I did," she said simply. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "There's food on the stove. You should eat something." "So should you." They went downstairs. They ate supper at the kitchen table while Clara worked and the house settled around them in the way old houses do when the night is cold and the fire is going and everyone is inside where they're supposed to be. It wasn't comfortable exactly. There was still too much between them that hadn't been said, too much that was uncertain, too much that could still go wrong in too many ways. But it was almost something. And outside, the snow kept falling on the frozen Montana frontier, which didn't care about almost, which had never in its long, hard life cared about almost, but which was at least, for now, keeping everyone inside the same four walls. That would have to be enough. Thomas was up and eating at the kitchen table by the third day. Not eating well, picking at things more than consuming them, pushing pieces of potato around the bowl with the listless focus of a child whose body was still making up its mind. But he was sitting upright in his chair with some color back in his cheeks, and Nora was beside him telling him about the cat, which she had apparently named Biscuit, same as the horse, which she saw no problem with whatsoever. "You can't name two things, Biscuit," Thomas said. He sounded annoyed, which Evelyn took as a sign of recovery. "I can name everything Biscuit if I want." "That's not how names work, Nora." "Papa named two cows almost the same thing. There's Bessie and there's Bess." That's different." "How is it different?" Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at Evelyn with the expression of a 9-year-old who has walked into an argument he cannot win. Evelyn kept her attention on the pot she was stirring. She wasn't going to help him. He needed to figure out Nora on his own. She had already observed that this was a necessary life skill for anyone in proximity to the girl. "It just is," Thomas said finally. Nora accepted this the way she accepted most things she disagreed with, by moving immediately to the next subject. "Evelyn, are you going to teach us today?" "After Thomas rests." "I don't need to rest," Thomas said. "You're going to rest anyway." He started to protest, and then thought better of it. She had brought him broth at 2 a.m. when his fever spiked again, and she thought he remembered that, though he hadn't said anything about it. There was a particular quality to the way he looked at her now. Careful, still guarded, but with something underneath that was paying closer attention than before. Clara, at the other end of the table, turned a page in the book she was reading and said nothing. She had said very little to Evelyn since Thomas's fever broke, but Evelyn had noticed something. Clara had started doing her own dishes before anyone asked, and yesterday she had, without comment, refilled the wood box beside the kitchen stove when it got low. These were things Clara had clearly been doing out of habit long before Evelyn arrived, but she was doing them a little differently now. Not as the person in charge of the house, but as a person contributing to it. Evelyn wasn't sure whether to say anything about this or leave it alone. She left it alone. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when Margaret Hale came by with her wagon and a crate of preserved goods she claimed she had too many of, which Evelyn suspected was not entirely true, but accepted without argument. Margaret installed herself at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and watched Evelyn work with the same frank attention she'd applied at their first meeting. "Clara bother you much?" Margaret asked. "No more than you'd expect. She's been running this kitchen since her mother died. That's a lot of territory to give up." "I know. I'm not trying to take it from her." Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between acknowledgement and skepticism. She drank her coffee. "Caleb tell you about the Crow situation?" Evelyn paused. "No, didn't think so." Margaret set her cup down. "Victor Crow owns about a third of the valley on the south end. He's been trying to get the rest of it since before Sarah died, but he's been quieter about it while Caleb was grieving. He won't stay quiet much longer." "What does he want with Caleb's land specifically?" "Water rights. The creek that runs through the Thornton property feeds a good portion of the north grazing land. Crow needs it to expand his operation. He's been arguing for 2 years that the original survey put that creek inside his boundary, not Caleb's." Margaret picked up her cup again. "He's wrong, but being wrong hasn't stopped him making life difficult." Evelyn said, "Has he made any formal moves?" Margaret looked at her with slightly more interest than before. "Not yet, but there's talk he's retained a lawyer out of Billings. I wanted you to know because when he comes calling, and he will, it's better to understand what you're walking into." After Margaret left, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking out at the snow-covered yard and the fence line and the pale winter sky above the mountains. She was thinking about water rights and survey lines and lawyers from Billings, and also about the fact that Caleb had not mentioned any of this, which meant either he didn't think she needed to know or he wasn't ready to let her inside that particular worry. She thought about asking him that evening. Then she thought about how he sat at the far end of the table and ate with his eyes, somewhere on the middle distance, and she decided to wait until he brought it up himself. He did not bring it up himself. Teaching the children happened in the afternoons, and the hour before the light got thin and the day's work pulled everyone in different directions. Evelyn had some schooling behind her. Her mother had believed in it fiercely, had made her finish even when the money was tight and there were better arguments for her time. And she understood that what the children needed was not a formal classroom, but something consistent and patient that met them where they were. Nora was easy. Nora approached every piece of new information with the same absolute enthusiasm she brought to everything. And if you could keep her sitting still long enough to absorb anything, she absorbed it completely. She was already reading simple sentences, and she was fiercely proud of this, and Evelyn let her be proud because she had earned it. Thomas was a different kind of learner, careful and thorough. A boy who didn't like to move forward until he understood each step behind him. He was behind where he should have been for his age, partly from the illness and partly, Evelyn suspected, from a difficult year and a half that had made concentration hard. She didn't push. She sat beside him and worked through things slowly, and she let him set the pace. And she noticed that he did better when she wasn't watching him too closely, when she was apparently doing something else at the table and just happened to be available if he had a question. Clara was the unexpected one. Clara had been educating herself out of whatever books were in the house, which wasn't many, and she was hungry for it in the way of a person who has had to be self-sufficient for too long. She didn't want to be taught so much, as she wanted someone to talk to about what she was reading. Evelyn adjusted accordingly. She stopped trying to instruct Clara and started asking her questions instead. What did she think about this? What did she make of that? And Clara, who was 12 and had opinions about everything and had been keeping most of them behind that flat, guarded face, started talking. Not to Evelyn, not exactly, but near Evelyn, which was a start. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into this arrangement, Clara looked up from a page she'd been reading and said, completely out of nowhere, "My mother wasn't educated." Evelyn kept her eyes on Nora's work. "No?" She could read and write, but she didn't have much schooling. She always said she wished she'd had more. Clara paused. She was smart, though. She knew things about plants and animals that nobody taught her. She just observed. That's a different kind of learning, not lesser. I know. Clara looked back at her book. I'm not saying she was less. I'm saying she wanted more and she didn't get it, and I don't want that to happen to me. Evelyn looked at her then, directly. Clara was looking at the page, her jaw set with the particular determination of a 12-year-old who is trying to sound matter-of-fact about something that matters enormously. Then we'll make sure it doesn't, Evelyn said. Clara didn't respond, but she didn't look away from the page with the defensive speed of someone who regretted saying something. She just kept reading. Evelyn went back to Nora's work, and the afternoon went on, and it was one of those things that didn't feel significant in the moment and turned out to be maths. The trouble with Victor Crow arrived on a Tuesday, which Evelyn would later think was apt because Tuesday was a gray day in every regard. Dull sky, dull cold, the kind of morning that offered nothing to hold on to. She heard the wagon before she saw it. A heavier rig than anything the Thorntons ran, with 2 horses and a driver in a good coat. The man who stepped down from the passenger side was somewhere in his 50s, with the compact, prosperous look of a person who had been winning for long enough that he'd forgotten what losing felt like. He wore a hat that was too fine for a ranch visit. He stood in the yard and looked at the house the way people sometimes look at things they intend to own. Caleb came out of the barn. He didn't look surprised. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could read the bodies. Caleb still, arms at his sides, chin level. Crow talking with the easy expansiveness of a man presenting an offer he expected to be accepted. The driver waiting by the wagon, examining his gloves. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes. Then Crow tipped his hat with a smile that didn't reach anything above his jaw, climbed back into his wagon, and drove away. Caleb came inside. He went directly to the stove and poured himself coffee, drank half of it standing, and set the cup down. "Who was that?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew. "Victor Crow." He said the name flat without inflection. Margaret mentioned him. Caleb looked up. Something moved through his expression. Not quite irritation, not quite relief that she already knew. "What did she say?" "The water rights, the survey dispute." He let out a long breath. "He's coming in with a lawyer. Says he's found documents that put the creek inside his original claim. He's giving me until the 1st of March to, he called it, reach an agreement." The last 2 words came out with a particular dryness, which means sign over the water rights or face a legal challenge. Evelyn said, "Do you have your original survey records?" "Somewhere. The paperwork from when my father settled this land. It's in a trunk in the attic. I haven't looked at it in years." "You should look at it." "I know I should look at it." He picked up his coffee cup again and put it down without drinking. "I've got 3 weeks of fence line that needs checking before it's buried under another snowfall, and cattle that are already stressed from the cold, and a son who's been sick on and off for 6 months. He said it without self-pity, just laying out the arithmetic of what he was carrying. "I know what I need to do. There's not always time to do it." Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me where the trunk is and I'll go through it." He looked at her. "You don't need to do that. I have time in the evenings. After the children are in bed, tell me what I'm looking for, and I'll find it." He studied her with that measuring look of his, the one she'd gotten used to, the one that seemed to be calculating something she wasn't entirely certain of. "Survey documents," he said finally. "A plat map if there is one. Anything with official seals or county clerk stamps." "All right. It might be a mess up there. I don't think it's been opened and—" "I can handle a mess," Evelyn said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across the yard and lifted a thin skiff of snow off the fence rail. Somewhere in the barn, Pete was moving around with the slow, deliberate efficiency of a man who didn't waste motion. "Why are you doing all this?" Caleb asked. Not accusatorially, just genuinely, as if he was trying to work out the answer to something. "Because you need help," she said, "and I'm here." That's not really an answer. She thought about it. She thought about what she could say that would be true without being too much. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said. "But that's not the main thing. The main thing is that I've been in places where nobody needed me, and it's worse than hard work. So if you need help, if this family needs help, then I'd rather be useful than anywhere else I can think of." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once and picked up his hat. "Trunk's in the back left corner of the attic," he said, "under a canvas. There's a lamp on the shelf at the top of the stairs." He went back out to the barn. Masu. The attic was cold and smelled of old wood and time. She went up 3 evenings in a row, after the dishes were done and the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. She brought the lamp and a blanket for her shoulders and worked through the trunk methodically, the way her mother had taught her to approach anything that needed organization. Slow down, don't rush, put like with like. It was mostly papers and old ledger books, some household records in a handwriting she recognized as a woman's. Sarah Thornton's, she thought, though she had no way to be certain, and some older records beneath those in a different hand entirely. Caleb's father's, maybe, or someone before that. On the third evening, she found what she was looking for. It was a plat map, official, with the county clerk's seal from 1871. It showed the original Thornton land claim in clear line with the creek running through the center of the property, well within the marked boundary, nowhere near the edge that Crow was apparently claiming. With it, folded inside the same envelope, was a letter from the Territorial Land Office confirming the survey and the water rights, signed by two witnesses whose names she didn't recognize. She sat in the cold attic with the lamp and looked at these documents for a long time. Then she carried them downstairs very carefully, as if they were something fragile, which in a way they were, not physically, but in what they meant, in the weight of what could happen to this family if they were lost or ignored or arrived too late. Caleb was still up. He was at the kitchen table with a lamp and what looked like a fence repair ledger, though he'd clearly stopped working on it because he was just sitting there. He looked up when she came in. She set the documents on the table in front of him. He looked down at them. He didn't touch them at first, just looked. Then he picked up the plat map and held it under the lamp and read it slowly. She watched his face. She watched something in it change. Not dramatically, not the way it would in a story, but in the small, specific way of a real person under real pressure, realizing that a thing they were afraid might not exist actually does. His jaw shifted. His breath came out differently than it had gone in. "This is it," he said. "That and the letter. Both of them together should be enough to challenge whatever Crow's lawyer tries to present." Caleb set the plat map down very carefully. He sat still for a moment, looking at it. "I'd given up on finding this," he said. "It was under everything else. I looked up there once, after he first started making noise about the survey. I didn't find anything." He shook his head. "Must have been in a different box. There were 3 trunks. This was in the second one. Second." He looked up at her. She was standing on the other side of the table, with her blanket still around her shoulders and a smudge of attic dust on her cheek that she wasn't aware of, and he looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than his usual guarded face because it was trying to contain something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. "Thank you," he said. He said. It was only 2 words, but the way he said them, not the quick, formal thank you of a man completing a social obligation, but something slower and more deliberate, the thank you of a person who means it and isn't used to saying so, landed differently than she'd expected. "Of course," she said. She went to bed. He sat at the table with the documents for a while longer, in the quiet house, in the cold kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the snow outside doing what snow did. The gossip reached town the week after Crow's visit, as gossip tends to do in small places where people have too little to occupy their minds and too much winter to fill. Evelyn heard it from the woman behind the counter at the general store, who told it to her not cruelly, but in the particular way of a person sharing information they've concluded is important and haven't considered the impact of half-lowered voice, half just stating facts. There was a woman out at the Thornton place who couldn't have children. Word had it Caleb Thornton had been deceived. Word had it some people thought he ought to send her back. Evelyn bought her flour and salt and whatever else was on the list, said thank you, and walked out. She made it to the wagon before she let herself feel it. Not tears. She wasn't going to cry in the middle of Harlan with people potentially watching. But the specific cold, flat feeling of being discussed, reduced, assessed, and found lacking by people who didn't know her. She had spent years learning not to let that feeling take hold, because once it took hold, it was difficult to dislodge. She sat in the wagon for a moment and looked at the gray winter street of this small town that was now, for the time being, her town, and breathed through it. Then she picked up the reins and drove back to the ranch. She didn't tell Caleb what she'd heard. She didn't tell anyone. But it sat in her somewhere, quiet and persistent, the way cold did. Thomas told her a few days later. He came into the kitchen while she was working and stood for a moment and then said, in the careful way he approached difficult things, "Billy Marsh at the feed store said something to Pete about you. I heard it." She kept her hands where they were. "What did he say?" "That you were..." He seemed to be choosing his words with extra care. "That Caleb made a bad deal. That you weren't really a proper wife." He looked at the floor. I told Pete that Billy Marsh didn't know anything about anything. She looked at him. He was looking at the floor with his jaw set in a way that reminded her suddenly and sharply of his father. "Thomas," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged, in the way of a 9-year-old boy who has done something kind and doesn't want to make a big thing of it. "It wasn't right," he said. "What he said?" "No," she agreed, "but some people are going to say it anyway." "Does that bother you?" She thought about being honest, which was what she'd decided she was going to be with these children as much as possible. "Yes," she said, "but I can carry it." Thomas nodded slowly. He seemed to be thinking about whether to say something else, and then he said it. "Clara thinks... I don't know if I should say this." "You don't have to. She thinks you should stay." He said it fast, like something being released. "She didn't say it like that. She said She said it wasn't fair what people were saying, and that you'd done more for this family in a month than most people do in a year. She said that to Margaret. I wasn't supposed to hear." Evelyn turned back to what she'd been doing. She took a moment before she said anything, because the thing that had moved through her when he said that needed a moment to settle before she could speak around it. "Don't tell her you told me," she said finally. "I wasn't going to." Good. She heard him exhale, some tension she hadn't noticed going out of him. Then he went to the table and sat down and picked up the book he'd left there that morning, and the kitchen went on being a kitchen, and outside the Montana winter went on being itself, indifferent and vast and utterly unimpressed by anything that happened inside the walls it was trying to push through. The incident in town had one consequence Evelyn hadn't anticipated. Nora found out about it. She found out the way 6-year-olds find out about most things. Through proximity and listening and the adult tendency to underestimate how much small children understand. Margaret had said something to Caleb within Nora's earshot, and Nora had absorbed it and said nothing until she was alone with Evelyn in the kitchen, where she climbed up onto her chair and sat there with her hands in her lap and a look on her face that Evelyn had not seen before. "Are people being mean about you?" she asked. Evelyn sat down across from her. "Some people." "Why?" She thought about this. "Because I'm different from what they expected, and sometimes people don't like things that are different." Nora considered this with great seriousness. "Margaret says they're being ignorant." "Margaret's probably right. I told Papa." Evelyn went still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him people were being mean and he should do something about it." Nora said this with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who has never had cause to doubt her father's ability to fix things. He didn't say anything, but he made a face. "What kind of face?" "His mad face. But the quiet kind, not the loud kind." Nora tilted her head. "Does it make you sad when people say things?" Evelyn looked at this small girl with her unbrushed curls and her enormous direct eyes and thought about the many years during which she had answered this question, or versions of it, alone. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but not as much when there are people around who know the truth." Nora seemed to be running this through whatever moral framework she'd assembled in 6 years of living. "We know the truth," she said finally. This seemed to settle the matter for her. She got down from her chair and went to find the cat. That evening, Caleb came in from the barn and sat across from Evelyn at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and without preamble said, "I went into town." She looked up from the mending she'd been doing. "I talked to a few people," he said. "I'm not going to tell you what I said because it's not worth repeating. But I want you to know that I did." She set the mending down. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed, "but I wanted to be clear about where I stood." He looked at her directly, which he didn't always do, and she felt the weight of it. "You are the wife of this household, Miss Hart. Evelyn, whatever the arrangement is between you and me, that's between you and me. The town doesn't get a say in it." She had spent the better part of a month in this house maintaining a kind of careful reserve, keeping herself from hoping too much, keeping herself at the measured distance of a woman who understood she was provisional. She felt that reserve shift, slightly, involuntarily. "Thank you," she said. "I should have done it sooner." "You were busy." "That's not a good enough reason." She picked the mending back up, not because she needed to do anything with it, but because looking at something other than him felt necessary right then. "How much trouble is Crow going to make?" she asked. "As much as he can." Caleb poured himself the last of the coffee. "But with those documents you found, we've got a real case. I sent word to a lawyer in Billings, a different one from Crow's. We'll see." "When does this go to a decision?" "Spring, maybe earlier." He drank his coffee. Before March, probably." He didn't finish that sentence. She noticed. She didn't finish it for him. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moving through the gap in the fence boards with a sound like something in pain. She was getting used to the sounds of this land, the way it expressed itself through the structures built against it, through the rattling windows and the groaning roof beams, and the particular creak of the third step on the staircase that she'd learned to avoid at night when the children were sleeping. She was learning the language of this place without meaning to, the way you learn any language you're immersed in long enough. She was not letting herself think about what that meant. She was trying very hard not to think about what that meant. But some things accumulate whether you intend them to or not. And this house, this family, these children, this difficult man who had gone into town to defend her without making a production of it, was accumulating in her the way snow accumulates, quietly, persistently, until one morning you look and there is more of it than you expected. The lamp burned low between them. They sat on opposite sides of the table and didn't say much else, and it was not comfortable, but it had stopped being entirely uncomfortable, which was its own kind of progress. And outside, Victor Crow was somewhere in the dark of this same Montana valley, not finished with his plans, not even close. But tonight he was in the dark, and they were in the light, and sometimes that was the only distinction that mattered. February came in hard, the kind of hard that Montana seemed to save up all winter and then release at once. Temperatures that turned the air brittle, wind that moved across the open land with nothing to slow it down, snow that had long since stopped being picturesque and had become instead a plain fact of existence, something you managed around rather than noticed. The cattle were stressed. 2 of the older ones had to be moved to the barn, which meant Pete and Caleb were up before light every morning, working through a rotation that left both of them short-tempered and exhausted before noon. Inside the house, Evelyn had developed her own rotation. She had stopped thinking of the work as a series of individual tasks and started thinking of it as a system. The fire, the water, the food, the children, the washing, the mending, the teaching. Each piece connected to the others, each needing to happen in a specific sequence, or everything downstream suffered. She had grown up in a house that ran itself on similar logic, though at smaller scale, and the instinct came back to her like muscle memory from something she'd nearly forgotten she knew. What she hadn't expected was how much she would come to need it. Not the work itself, but the needing of it. The sensation of being in the right place. She tried not to think about the train ticket she had looked at twice this week, still folded in the bottom of her traveling bag. March was not far away. Thomas had a good stretch through the first half of the month. He ate well, he slept through the nights, and he started showing up to the afternoon lessons with something close to enthusiasm, particularly when Evelyn found an old book of American geography in the attic on one of her document hunting trips and started working through it with him. He was interested in maps the way some children are interested in animals or machines, with an intensity that was almost physical. He would sit bent over a page tracing river systems with one finger, asking questions about where things led, where things came from, what happened at the edges. "Does the Missouri really go all the way to St. Louis?" he asked one afternoon. "Eventually, yes. It joins the Mississippi south of there." "And the Mississippi goes to the ocean?" "The Gulf of Mexico, which is part of the ocean, yes." Thomas sat with this. His finger moved along the drawn line of the river, following it south off the page. "So the water from this creek," he said slowly, "could end up in the ocean. If it made it to the right river, theoretically." He looked up at her. "Crow wants to take the creek." She hadn't brought up Crow with the children. She hadn't needed to. Children in small houses hear everything, and Thomas was old enough to have been listening for months. "Your father is handling it," she said, "with the papers you found." "Yes." He looked back at the map. "Good," he said, with the quiet conviction of someone who had already decided how he felt about this. Then he went back to tracing rivers. Clara, sitting across from them, turned a page in her own book and said nothing, but she had stopped leaving the room when Evelyn sat down with Thomas, which was its own kind of statement. The creek that ran through the Thornton property was normally a modest thing, 20 feet across at its widest, shallow enough in summer that Nora had waded it unsupervised and gotten nothing more than wet to the knee. In February, it was frozen solid, and in the first week of March, it was frozen and then not frozen and then dangerous, which was the worst thing a creek could be. The snowmelt started earlier than anyone expected. 3 days of temperatures above freezing, which was almost unheard of in early March. And the creek went from solid to moving in the space of 48 hours. It rose fast. By the morning of the fourth day, it was over its banks on the low east side, spreading across the flat ground there in a thin brown sheet that was moving faster than it looked. The bridge was old. Caleb had been meaning to have it reinforced since the previous fall, which meant it had been on the list alongside a dozen other things that didn't get done before winter closed in. It was timber, 6 feet wide, built by his father, still solid at the main post, but soft in 2 of the cross planks that Evelyn had noticed flexed when you walked over them. She had noticed this the way she noticed most things about the ranch. Without comment, filing it away. The morning it happened, she had sent Thomas to return a tool to Pete in the east barn. It was a simple errand, one he'd done a dozen times. The east barn was across the creek. She was in the kitchen when she heard it. It wasn't a loud sound. That was the thing she would remember afterward, how small the sound was for what it meant. A crack, like a branch coming off a tree in wind. Then a shout, Pete's voice, from the direction of the creek. Then nothing, which was worse than the shout. She was out the back door before she had finished understanding what she'd heard. She ran across the yard. The ground was saturated, and her boots went into the ankle with every step, and she didn't slow down. She could see the creek from the yard now, so brown and high and moving with that deceptive speed of snowmelt water that looks slow until you're in it. She could see the bridge. The main structure was still standing, but one of the cross planks, the second one from the east end, the one she'd noticed, had given way. There was a gap in the decking, rough and jagged, about 3 feet across, and Thomas was on the bridge. He was flat on his stomach, both arms through the gap where the plank had been, his legs scrambling on the wet timber for purchase. The current below him was loud and close. She could hear it from where she was, still 30 feet away. He hadn't gone in. He was holding on. But his face, when he turned it toward the sound of her coming, was the face of a child who knows he's about to lose his grip. Pete was on the east bank. He'd gotten across before the plank gave, and now the gap was between him and the boy, and the bridge had shifted enough in the current that putting weight on it from the other direction was not something to do without thinking about first. Evelyn reached the west bank. "Don't move," she said to Thomas, though she was not at all sure he was capable of movement in any direction other than down. She looked at the bridge. She looked at the gap. She looked at the water below it, which was not deep enough to be survivable if he went in, at this temperature, in this current. "Ma'am," Pete said from the other side, and the way he said it, tightly, not finishing the sentence, told her he didn't have a plan. She didn't have a plan either. She had about 4 seconds of assessment, and then she moved. She got onto the bridge on her hands and knees. This was not a calculated decision, so much as the only decision there was. On her hands and knees, she distributed her weight differently than standing, and if the plank to the left of the gap was softer than the one to the right, she needed to know before she put her full weight on it. The timber was wet and cold under her palms. The bridge swayed slightly in the current, not dramatically, not like something about to collapse, but with the low, persistent movement of something that was being pushed and was tired of holding. She moved to the edge of the gap. Thomas was looking at her. His face was wet. Creek water splashing up from below, or tears, or both. She couldn't tell. His arms were shaking. He was a 9-year-old boy who had been sick half the winter, and he did not have much left. "Listen to me," she said. She kept her voice even. "When I reach across, I need you to grab my arm. Not my hand. My arm, as high up as you can reach. Can you do that?" "I can't." His voice broke. "I can't let go." "You're not letting go. You're transferring. You're going from holding the bridge to holding me, and it happens in 1 second. 1 second, and then I've got you." He looked at her. He looked at the water below him. "Thomas," she said. He looked back at her face. "1 second," she said. She stretched across the gap. The bridge groaned beneath her, a low structural sound that she felt in her sternum more than heard, and her legs went out behind her across the wet planking, and she reached her right arm down into the gap as far as it would go. He let go with one hand and grabbed her forearm. The shift in weight was immediate and violent. He swung, and his legs dropped, and for one moment she was holding 80 pounds of terrified boy over moving water with nothing between her and the creek except a plank that was flexing under her in a way she did not like at all. She pulled. It was not graceful. It was not anything except necessary. Her left arm locked around the nearest bridge post, her right arm hauling, the wood screaming beneath her, Thomas scrabbling with his free hand and then his knee, and then somehow getting purchase on the edge of the gap and coming up onto the planking beside her in a wet scramble that collapsed both of them flat against the bridge decking. She held on to him. He was shaking so hard she could feel it through her own body. She kept her arm around him and pressed her face against the cold timber of the bridge and took one breath and then another. Below them, the creek moved on, unconcerned. "Okay," she said into his hair. "Okay, I've got you." He didn't say anything. He was crying. She could feel it. And she didn't say anything about that, just kept her arm around him and waited for the worst of the shaking to stop. "Can you move?" she asked after a while. "Yes," he managed. "We're going back the way I came. Same way, on our hands and knees. Stay close to the left side, away from the gap, all right? All right?" They went back across the bridge together. Slowly, Thomas pressed against her left side, both of them staying low, and the bridge held. It held, but the third plank from the west end moved in a way that told her it wasn't going to hold much longer, and she filed that away too. They reached the bank. Pete was calling from the east side. He'd gone back through the shallow bend upstream to cross, and Evelyn could hear him coming. She sat on the cold, wet ground of the bank with Thomas beside her, and she looked at her hands, which were scraped and bleeding slightly from the bridge planking, and she took several long breaths. Thomas looked at her hands. "You're hurt," he said. "It's nothing. Surface." "You're bleeding." "I've bled from worse." She closed her hands and looked at him. His face was pale under the tear streaks and the creek water, and he was still shaking, but his eyes were clear. "How are you?" "Scared," he said, without any of the self-consciousness he usually brought to admissions like that. "Good," she said. "That's the right response." He let out something that was almost a laugh. "That's a weird thing to say. Scared means you understood what was happening. Scared means you're paying attention." She paused. "You grabbed my arm. First try." He nodded slowly. Some of the shaking was leaving him. "That's what mattered," she said. She didn't know Caleb had seen it until she was walking back to the house. He had come from the north field and cut across when he heard Pete shout, and he had arrived at the creek bank just as she was pulling Thomas over the edge of the gap. She learned this afterward from Pete, who mentioned it with the particular careful neutrality of a man who has witnessed something and is reporting it accurately and without editorial. What she knew in the moment was that Caleb was in the yard when she came back across it with Thomas beside her, and that he was standing completely still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. He looked at Thomas first. He put one hand on the back of his son's neck and tilted the boy's face up and checked him. Eyes, color, whether anything was wrong, the way a man does when he has been frightened and is getting the fear out through his hands. Thomas submitted to this examination. "I'm all right," Thomas said. "Inside," Caleb said. "Get dry. Tell Clara to heat water." Thomas went. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She was wet from the knees down, and her palms were scraped, and she had mud up her right side from lying on the bridge. She was aware she did not look particularly composed. He looked at her hands. He took a step toward her. "Let me see," he said. "They're fine." "Evelyn." She held them out. He took them both in his. His hands were rough and warm, and he turned hers over with a carefulness she hadn't expected from those hands. And he looked at the scrapes with the same focused attention he'd given Thomas. "Nothing deep?" she said. "No." He didn't let go right away. He stood there in the cold, wet yard, holding her hands, looking at them, and something was happening in his face that she didn't know how to read and wasn't sure she should try. "You went out on that bridge," he said. His voice was different than usual, quieter and less controlled. "There wasn't time to think about it. The plank was... I know what the plank was. It could have... I know." She said it gently, but it didn't. He looked up from her hands to her face. They were close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes that didn't come from smiling, and something behind those eyes that was working very hard at something. "Why?" he asked. And then before she could answer, he said, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say there wasn't time to think, but I've been standing here and I keep... He stopped. He let go of her hands, and she could feel the effort of that. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't. She didn't know what to say to that. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. And most of it was the wrong size for standing in a cold, wet yard in the middle of a March morning. He's safe, she said finally. That's what matters. Caleb nodded. He turned and looked at the creek, still running high and brown beyond the fence line. He stood like that for a moment, his back to her. I'll have Pete take the bridge apart this afternoon, he said. We've got a shallow ford downstream. We'll use that until I can rebuild it. The third plank from the west is going too, she said. Not just the one that gave. He turned back to look at her. You noticed that while you were out there? I was on my hands and knees, hard to miss. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not quite a smile, not quite that, but in the neighborhood of something warmer than anything she'd seen from him before. It was brief, gone almost before she was certain she'd seen it. Come inside, he said. Get warm. That evening was different from the evenings before it. She couldn't have said precisely what had changed, except that it had. Caleb sat at the table after supper, not with his ledger or his fence records, but with nothing in front of him, and he talked to the children, properly talked, not the management of information that usually passed for conversation at the dinner table. He asked Thomas about the geography book, and Thomas told him about the Missouri River with an enthusiasm he usually kept banked, and Caleb listened with the patience of a man who was making a conscious effort at something. Nora climbed into his lap after supper, which she often tried to do and he often gently redirected, and he let her stay there. Clara watched all of this from her end of the table with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. Watchful, something shifting beneath the surface of it. Evelyn washed the dishes. She was aware of the room behind her in a way she wasn't always aware of it. After the children were in bed, Caleb brought his coffee to the table and she brought hers, and they sat. And it was not the careful, managed quiet of the previous weeks, but something different, a quiet that had room in it. Thomas told me what you said, Caleb said. On the bridge. That scared meant he was paying attention. It's true. It's also... He seemed to be working out how to say something. It's the right thing to tell a boy who's been scared most of his life. Not told him he shouldn't be scared, but he stopped, started again. Sarah used to... She did the opposite. She meant well. She'd say, don't be afraid. There's nothing to be afraid of. He'd end up more afraid. Evelyn said nothing. She was a good woman, Caleb said. I want to be clear about that. She was a good woman and a good mother, and she... He looked at his coffee. But she and Thomas were... They struggled to understand each other. He was more afraid than she knew what to do with. He's very brave, Evelyn said. He's brave in the way of people who are afraid and do things anyway. Caleb looked at her. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. They sat quietly for a while. The lawyer in Billings wrote back, he said. With the documents you found, he thinks we have a strong case. He's going to request a formal hearing. It'll likely be in April. That's good. It means we need to hold until April. He turned his cup on the table, which means you need to... He stopped. She knew what he was about to say. The arrangement had been until spring. Spring was here. I know, she said. I'm not... He looked up. I'm not asking you to go. The sentence sat between them. She looked at him steadily. He was looking at her in that direct, assessing way, but it was different now from the way he'd looked at her on the platform in October. The assessment then had been of a stranger. This was something else. What are you asking? She said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I don't know how to do this. I've been told I'm not easy to be around, and I think that's accurate. I had one marriage, and I wasn't a perfect husband, and I know it. I'm not looking for perfect. I know you're not. He let out a breath. That's part of it. She waited. The children need you, he said, but that's not... He shook his head, and she could see him struggling with the particular difficulty of a man who doesn't talk about himself being forced to talk about himself. I'm not asking you to stay for the children. They're a reason, but they're not the whole reason. The lamp between them burned steady. Outside the window, the creek was still running high, and she could hear it faintly through the walls, that persistent sound of water moving over stone, water finding its way. "I bought a train ticket," she said. He went still. "Last week. Before the bridge." She said it quietly, not as an accusation, just as a fact that needed to be between them. I had convinced myself that I was going to leave before you asked me to, because I thought it would be easier than waiting." He didn't say anything. "I still have it," she said. I haven't decided." "What would make you decide?" She thought about this honestly. She thought about what she had been telling herself and what was true underneath it. "Whether this is real," she said. "Not the work, not the arrangement. Whether what's happening here is, whether it means what I think it might mean, or whether I'm wrong about it." Caleb said, "You're not wrong about it." He said it plainly, without decoration, in the same tone he used for practical facts. The way he said the creek will flood by morning, or the north fence needs work before December. And somehow, that was exactly right. Not a declaration, not a speech, just a man telling the truth because he decided it was time to. She looked at him. He looked back. "I need time," she said. "Not a rejection. A real thing." "I know. And I need to know that you won't change your mind when it gets hard. Because it's going to get hard. The land case is going to be hard, and the children are going to be hard, and this," she gestured at the space between them, "whatever this is, it's going to be hard." "Most things worth anything are." She nodded slowly. Outside, the Montana night settled around the house with its usual indifference, and the creek ran on over its stones, and somewhere in the east barn, a cow made a sound that Pete would check on in the morning. The domestic machinery of this life went on operating around them, indifferent to the conversation at the kitchen table. "All right," she said. He waited. "I'll stay," she said, "for now. Not because of the crow situation, not just because the children need—" She paused. "I'll stay because I want to, because I think this might be the thing I came here for." Something in his face eased, not dramatically. This was not a man who did things dramatically, but something that had been held went slightly less held. "That's enough," he said. "For now, that's enough." She got up and carried her coffee cup to the wash basin, and he sat at the table, and the lamp burned between them for a while longer before she said goodnight and went to her room. She lay on her narrow bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling. She thought about the bridge. She thought about the weight of Thomas in her arms over that cold, moving water, and the bridge groaning under her, and the 4 seconds of assessment before she'd moved. She thought about what it meant that she had not, in those 4 seconds, thought about herself at all, had thought only about the boy, only about the gap, only about what needed to happen in the next moment. She thought about what kind of person makes that particular calculation automatically. She thought, maybe this is what I am. Maybe this is what I've always been, and I just needed a place where it was the right thing to be. The train ticket was in the bottom of her bag. She thought about it lying there, small and folded, still valid. She thought about the creek finding its way. She did not take the ticket out. She turned on her side and closed her eyes, and listened to the house settle around her, and let the sound of the water carry her towards sleep. What she did not know, lying there in the dark, was that Victor Crow had met with his lawyer that same evening in a warm office in Harlan, and had come away with a plan that had nothing to do with fair hearings or honest evidence. What she did not know was that the man had spent the last 2 months acquiring something, not a legitimate survey, but something that could look like one to anyone who didn't know what to look for. What she did not know was that the 1st of April was 7 weeks away, and that 7 weeks for a man with money and the willingness to use it without scruple was more than enough time. She didn't know any of that yet. She knew the creek was running high. She knew Thomas was safe in his bed upstairs. She knew that Caleb Thornton had sat across a kitchen table and told her she was not wrong about what was between them, in the same voice he used for practical facts. And she knew that the ticket in the bottom of her bag was going to stay there unfolded until she decided what to do with it. That was enough to carry into sleep. For now, that was enough. The creek went back down by the 2nd week of March. It didn't happen gracefully. Nothing about that creek did anything gracefully. But the temperatures dropped again after those strange warm days, and the melt slowed, and by the 15th the water was back inside its banks, and the mud at the edges had gone hard again in the overnight cold. Caleb and Pete tore out the old bridge planking the day after Thomas's accident and stacked the usable timber in the barn for other purposes. What remained of the structure, the two main posts, the crossbeam, stood out there over the shrunken creek looking skeletal and purposeless, and they used the ford downstream until Caleb could get to the rebuilding, which he planned for April when the ground would hold post work without heaving. April. Everything seemed to be pointing at April. The hearing date came through in a letter from the Billings lawyer, a man named Aldous Fitch, whose correspondence was precise and dry and gave nothing away about his personality. The hearing was set for April 3rd in the county courthouse in Harlan. Crow's attorney had filed a formal claim asserting prior water rights based on what the letter called a secondary survey document predating the Thornton claim. Fitch recommended they arrive with the original plat map and the land office letter and be prepared for the other side to challenge both on procedural grounds. Caleb read this letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and set it down and looked at the wall. "What does procedural grounds mean?" Evelyn asked. "It means they'll argue the documents aren't valid even if they're real." He picked up his coffee. "Fitch says we should bring anyone who can speak to the chain of ownership. My father's been dead 15 years. His business partner died before that." He drank his coffee. "I'm the chain of ownership." "Then you'll speak to it." "I'm not a man who does well in rooms full of lawyers." She looked at him. He was not saying this as self-pity. It was a plain assessment, the kind he gave about fence posts and cattle health, something to be planned around. "You don't need to do well," she said. "You need to tell the truth. Those aren't the same thing." He looked at her with something dry in his eyes. "You've been in a lot of courtrooms?" "No. But I know the difference between performing well and being honest, and in my experience, only one of them holds up under pressure." He considered this. Then he folded the letter and put it in the chest pocket of his shirt, which was where he kept things he needed to deal with and hadn't yet, and he went back out to the barn. But see, 3 days before the hearing, Victor Crow made his move. It didn't come as a visit this time. It came as a document, delivered by a man Evelyn didn't recognize, someone from out of town, well dressed in the way of a man employed to look authoritative rather than to do physical work. He came to the door in the early afternoon while Caleb was out on the property and handed her an envelope with her name on it and the words Thornton Ranch below it, and left without saying much. She set it on the table. She stood in the kitchen looking at it for a moment. She was aware that it was not addressed to Caleb specifically, which might have been an oversight or might have been intentional, a way of implying that Evelyn was the addressee, that whatever was inside was meant for her specifically. She opened it. Inside was a single page, typed with a lawyer's letterhead at the top. It informed her, in the careful language of a document designed to be technically accurate while being practically threatening, that in the event the upcoming hearing produced a judgment in favor of Victor Crow's water rights claim, certain financial obligations attached to the Thornton land deed would become immediately payable. It outlined a series of loan documents, apparently held by a lending entity associated with Crow's business interests, against which the Thornton property had apparently been used as collateral at some point in the past. She read it twice. She was not a lawyer. She did not understand all of it. What she understood was that if Crow won the hearing, he intended to call in debts that would put the ranch itself at risk. Not just the water rights, but the land, the buildings, everything. She set the page down on the table. She thought about the train ticket in the bottom of her bag. She thought about how she had not taken it out in 3 weeks. She thought about Caleb's face in the yard after the bridge, holding her scraped hands. She put the letter back in the envelope, went to the window, and looked out at the property. The barn, the fence line, the outbuildings, the country going away in every direction under a sky that had gone pale and high with the approach of real spring. She had come to this place in October, and it had been frozen and indifferent, and she had been a stranger to all of it. She did not feel like a stranger to it now. She went upstairs to the attic. She had been through the trunks already. She knew that. She had found the plat map and the land office letter, and those were in Caleb's keeping, and those were what Aldous Fitch was planning to use at the hearing. There was nothing else up there. She told herself this while she lit the lamp and carried it to the back left corner and stood in front of the trunks she'd already gone through. Then she thought about what Crow's letter had said. Loan documents, collateral. Not a survey dispute, something older, something that had gotten tangled into the land's history before Caleb inherited it. She opened the first trunk again. She had gone through it looking for survey records the first time. She had been organized and thorough. But she had been looking for one specific category of thing, and that meant she had registered the other papers without reading them. Ledger pages, correspondence, household records. She had put like with like and moved on. She started again from the top, this time reading everything. It was slow. The lamp made a circle of yellow light around her, and outside it the attic was cold and dark and smelled of old wood and mouse and time. She went through the first trunk completely and found nothing that helped and started on the second. The second trunk was Caleb's father's. She had determined this on her first search from the handwriting in the ledgers, which was different from anything else in the house, large and slightly slanted. She went through his correspondence first. Most of it was ranch business, cattle prices, supply orders. There were a few letters from a bank in Helena, routine, about a line of credit that had been paid off in 1879, from what she could tell. There were 2 letters from a man named G. Alderman, the business partner Caleb had mentioned, brief and practical in tone, about land boundaries and grazing agreements. She was at the bottom of the second trunk when she found it. It was a letter, not typed, but handwritten, on paper that was thinner and more fragile than the rest, older than most of what surrounded it. It was from the same G. Alderman, but the tone was different from the business letters. It was dated 1876, which put it a full year before the county land records she'd found, and it was addressed to Caleb's father by his first name. She read it carefully, then read it again. The letter described an agreement between Alderman and a man named Crow, not Victor Crow, but his father from the previous generation, regarding the eastern boundary of the Thornton claim. Alderman wrote that he had declined Crow's offer to purchase the water rights to the creek, that he had made this refusal in writing to Crow and kept a copy, and that he was sending a copy of that refusal to Caleb's father for his records in case the matter ever came up again. He wrote that Crow Sr. had been aggressive about the proposition and that he didn't trust the man not to make claims in the future about agreements that had never been reached. At the bottom of the letter, folded separately, was the copy Alderman had mentioned, a brief document signed by Alderman and witnessed by 2 names, refusing Crow Sr.'s offer and asserting the creek as Thornton property. It was exactly the kind of document that, in the context of a legal hearing about the history of those water rights, made Victor Crow's claim not just weak, but demonstrably dishonest. His father had tried to buy what he was now claiming he already owned by right. You could not claim a right you had once tried to purchase. Evelyn sat in the cold attic with the letter and its attachment on her knees and the lamp burning beside her. She thought, this is what he was hoping we'd never find. She thought, his lawyer knew to look for this. That's why the hearing was filed with a secondary survey, to muddy the water, to make it about competing documents rather than about what his father had actually done. She carried everything downstairs very carefully. Caleb came in from the north field at dusk, stamping mud off his boots, and found Evelyn at the kitchen table with 3 separate documents laid out in front of her, the plat map he already knew about, and 2 things he didn't. He looked at them. He looked at her. Sit down, she said. He sat. She walked him through it, methodically, the way she'd worked it out herself. The Alderman letter, the refusal document, what it meant in the context of what Crow's lawyer had filed. She watched his face as he read, the way she'd watched it when she brought him the plat map. But this time it was different, because this time the thing he was processing was not just relief, but anger, the specific anger of a man who understands he has been targeted by something calculated and patient. When he finished reading, he set the papers down. His father tried to buy it, he said, in 1876, and your father's partner refused in writing, which means the family has known for 50 years that the water rights weren't theirs, and they've been waiting for a generation when the records would be unclear enough to make a claim. Caleb was quiet. He looked at the papers on the table, and she could see him thinking through something. Not just the legal question, but something else. Something about the kind of patient, inherited dishonesty that could wait 50 years for an opportunity. I need to get these to Fitch, he said. Tomorrow morning. He needs time to... We have 3 days. It's enough. He looked at her. You went back up there. I had a feeling I'd missed something. I told you I'd already looked. You looked for the survey records. I looked for something different. She paused. I'm not criticizing how you looked. You were looking for what you thought was there. I was looking for what Crow was afraid might be there. He was quiet for a moment. That's a different way of thinking about it. It's how my mother used to search for things. She said you find what you're looking for and miss everything else. So sometimes you have to look for the wrong thing on purpose. Something moved in his expression. She sounds like she was smart. She was. She didn't have much else to work with, so she used what she had. He looked at the papers again. He put one hand flat on the table next to them, not touching them, just there, grounding himself, maybe. She understood that impulse. Evelyn, he said. She waited. I want you to be at the hearing. She had not expected that. I don't have any official... I'm not asking you for official anything. I'm asking you to be there. He looked up at her. I don't do well in rooms full of lawyers. You said yourself, I need to tell the truth rather than perform. I do better when... He stopped. The sentence had taken him somewhere he hadn't quite intended to go, and she could see him working out whether to finish it. I do better when you're there, he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table, across the documents they'd assembled between them, in the last light of a March evening, with the creek running low and steady outside and the barn settling into its nighttime creaks, and she said, All right. The morning of April 3rd came in clear and cold with a sky so blue it looked painted, the kind of Montana spring morning that seemed designed to remind you what the winter had been costing you. Evelyn wore her better dress, which was not remarkable but was clean and pressed, and her coat that was still not warm enough but was all she had, and she sat beside Caleb on the wagon bench on the drive into Harlan with the 3 documents in a leather envelope on her lap. The children stayed with Margaret. Claire had stood in the yard as they left with her arms crossed, in the way she crossed them when she was trying not to show she was worried, and Nora had held Thomas's hand and waved with the other, and Thomas had given Evelyn a look that said a great deal more than he was going to put into words. Harlan's courthouse was the most substantial building in town, stone-fronted, 2 stories, with a wooden addition on the back that had been built more recently and didn't quite match. There were 2 horses and 3 wagons outside when they arrived, which was more activity than the building usually saw and had drawn a small gathering of people on the opposite boardwalk who were there for the specific reason that nothing exciting happened in Harlan very often, and this qualified. Aldous Fitch was waiting inside, a compact man in his 50s with wire-frame spectacles, and the manner of someone who found most things professionally unremarkable but was currently operating at heightened attention. He looked at the documents Evelyn handed him and was quiet for a long moment. Where did you find this? He asked. The attic. The alderman letter has been in Caleb's family's possession since 1876? In a trunk, under other papers. Fitch looked at it again. Crow's attorney is going to argue provenance. He's going to say it could be fabricated. The paper is 50 years old. The handwriting matches the other alderman letters in the same trunk. And the witness names on the refusal document. I checked them against the 1876 county directory, which I also found in the attic. Both names appear. Both were resident in the county at that time. Fitch looked at her over the top of his spectacles. He seemed to be recalibrating something. You brought the directory? It's in the envelope. He opened the envelope and looked. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, Mrs. Thornton, Miss Hart, we're not... She glanced at Caleb, who was watching this exchange with an expression she couldn't read. It's Miss Hart. Miss Hart, Fitch said without particular surprise. You've done most of my preparation for me. I had time, she said. Victor Crow arrived with his attorney, a younger man named Paulson, confident and quick, and 2 men Evelyn didn't recognize who appeared to be there for the purpose of being seen with Crow, which was a form of argument she understood and discounted accordingly. Crow looked at Caleb first when he came in, and then at Evelyn, and something shifted in his expression that was brief and hard to name, something recognizing that the situation was different from what he'd expected. The hearing was not a trial. It was an administrative proceeding before a county judge named Beaumont, who was old enough that he'd seen most kinds of land disputes that could happen in this part of Montana and had the air of a man who was going to hear everything presented and make up his own mind regardless of who was better at talking. Evelyn had been uncertain what to expect and was relieved to find this. Paulson went first. He laid out Crow's claim with the polished efficiency of a man who had done this often. The secondary survey document, dated 1868, which purported to show the creek boundary differently from the 1871 plat. He cited precedent. He used language about established rights and prior settlement and the difficulty of relying on documents of uncertain provenance. And he said all of it smoothly enough that Evelyn, watching the judge's face, could not immediately tell what Beaumont was making of it. Then Fitch presented their case. He started with the 1871 plat map and the land office letter, which he had organized to walk through methodically. The date, the seal, the witness signatures, the clear boundary lines showing the creek inside the Thornton claim. Beaumont asked 2 questions about the county clerk's seal, which Fitch answered precisely. Paulson objected to something about the witnessing procedure, and Beaumont overruled him without particular ceremony. Then Fitch laid the alderman letter on the table. He explained it carefully. The date, the context, what it established about the Crow family's knowledge of the Thornton water rights a full year before the official survey, and 3 years before the secondary survey Crow was now presenting as evidence. Paulson objected immediately and loudly. Provenance, authenticity, chain of custody. Fitch was ready. He laid out the 1876 county directory, open to the page where both witness names appeared. He laid out the other alderman correspondence from the same period, demonstrating consistent handwriting. He noted that the paper, the ink, and the physical condition of the document were consistent with its claimed age and inconsistent with recent fabrication. Beaumont picked up the alderman letter and read it himself. He read it slowly, the way a man reads something he intends to understand rather than skim. The room was quiet. Crow, across the table, was not looking at the letter. He was looking at Evelyn. She looked back at him steadily, without expression. He looked away first. Beaumont set the letter down. He looked at Paulson. This letter states that your client's father attempted to purchase water rights to this creek from the Thornton party in 1876 and was refused. Paulson said, "The authenticity of that document, I heard your objection, Mr. Paulson." Beaumont's voice had not raised but had become notably more exact. "I'm asking you a logical question. If a man purchases a property right, does that action suggest he believed he already owned it?" Paulson had the specific look of a man who has reached the bottom of his prepared answers. The circumstances of a purchase attempt may not reflect. They reflect, Beaumont said, that at minimum, the Crow family was not operating under the belief in 1876 that these water rights were already theirs by prior claim. He set the letter down. The secondary survey presented by your client is dated 1868. If the Crow family possessed a document from 1868 establishing their prior right to this water, why would they have attempted to purchase it in 1876? The room was very quiet. Paulson said something about interpretation of historical documents. Beaumont let him finish. Then he said that he would take a brief recess to review the materials. He came back in 20 minutes. He found in favor of the Thornton claim on all points. The 1871 plat map and the land office letter were entered as the controlling documents. The secondary survey presented by Crow was found insufficient to challenge the existing record, particularly in light of the alderman correspondence. The water rights to the creek running through the Thornton property were confirmed as belonging to the Thornton estate. He also noted in the dry and careful language of a man choosing his words with precision that the attempt to assert rights that the claimant's own family had attempted to purchase from the current holder raised questions about the good faith of the present proceeding that the court would be noting in its record. Crow's face, across the room, had gone flat and controlled in the way of a man who has been losing and is working very hard at not showing it. His lawyer gathered his papers. They left without speaking. Outside in the April morning, the small gathering from the boardwalk had grown somewhat. Word had gotten around the way it did in small towns, and there were 10 or 12 people on the street who had come to see what happened. Margaret Hale was among them, Evelyn realized. She didn't know when Margaret had arrived or how she'd known to come, but there she was, arms folded, watching the courthouse door. Fitch said something to Caleb about the loan documents that had been in Crow's letter, that without the water rights, The financial threat attached to them was essentially hollow, that he'd look into it further, but Caleb should not be unduly worried. Caleb shook his hand and said something Evelyn didn't quite hear. Then Fitch turned to her. "Miss Hart," he said. He hesitated for a moment. "You should practice law." She looked at him. "I don't have the education for that." "You found the document, you verified it, you organized the evidentiary presentation." He seemed to be genuinely working something out. "There are law offices in Billings that could use someone who thinks the way you do." She said, "I have a ranch to help run." Fitch raised an eyebrow, fractionally. "Well," he said, "the offer stands, if that changes." He went to get his horse. Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps in the April sun. It was genuinely warm for the first time since October, Basund. Not summer warm, but the real warmth of a season that intended to stay, that had been building toward this since February and was finally arriving. She could feel it through her coat, through the fabric of her dress, all the way in. Caleb came to stand beside her. He stood close enough that she was aware of him, the solid, deliberate presence of him, the way he occupied space without apology or excess. "They're all looking," he said. She glanced at the people on the street. They were, in fact, looking. Not unkindly. Most of them with the frank interest of people watching something they'd had opinions about from a distance and were now recalibrating. Mrs. Draper from the general store. The man from the feed store whose name she didn't know. 2 ranching families she'd seen at a distance. Margaret, at the far end, who gave Evelyn a single nod when she caught her eye. "Let them look," Evelyn said. She felt Caleb's hand find hers. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just his hand beside hers and then around it, the way he did most things, practically and without fuss. She didn't pull away. They stood there in the April sun on the courthouse steps, in front of a town that had spent 5 months making up its mind about her, and she held Caleb Thornton's hand and looked out at the mountains going white and brown above the valley and thought, "This is real. Whatever comes next, this is real." "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "When we get home." "All right. It's not about the land case." She looked at him sideways. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working out how to say something that mattered. "I want to ask you something, and I want to do it properly. Not on courthouse steps in front of half the town." She looked forward again. She was aware of the warmth of his hand around hers, of the warmth of the sun, of the particular quality of air that had finally decided to stop being winter. "All right," she said again. They walked down the steps to where the wagon was waiting, and Margaret intercepted them at the bottom with the expression of someone who had been watching the whole proceeding from across the street and had significant opinions about it. She looked at their joined hands with the frank satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something and is not going to be quiet about it. "Well," she said. "Don't," Caleb said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were absolutely going to say something." Margaret smiled, which was not a common occurrence, and it changed her whole face. She looked at Evelyn. "Fitch tell you that you should be a lawyer?" Evelyn blinked. "How could you know that?" "Because I've watched you for 5 months organize everything in front of you like you're building a case." She patted Evelyn's arm, once, firmly. "Go home. Those children have been worrying since breakfast." The drive back was quieter than the drive in, but it was a different kind of quiet. The tension that had been building toward this day had somewhere to release now, and it released slowly, the way held breath releases. Not all at once, but in stages. The body remembering how to be less braced for impact. The mountains were clear in every direction. The road back was showing the first green at its edges. Small, preliminary, the grass that comes up first because it's close to the ground and catches whatever warmth there is. The creek, when they crossed the ford downstream of the missing bridge, was running low and steady and minding its own business. "What you did in there?" Caleb said after they'd crossed. "Fitch did the presenting. You found the document and the directory, and he seemed to be working out how to say something he hadn't had practice saying. You thought differently about it than I did. You thought about what Crow was afraid of instead of what we needed. My mother's system. I know. He looked ahead at the road. "I'm trying to say thank you in a way that's accurate." "You don't need to. I want to." He was quiet for a moment. I want you to know that I see what you've done. Not just today, all of it. He still wasn't looking at her, which was, she had come to understand, often when he said the truest things, looking ahead rather than at the thing he was trying to articulate, as if it was easier to speak honestly when he wasn't watching for the reaction. Since October, the children, the house, the attic, twice, Thomas on the bridge. He paused. Me, what you've done for me. I'm not good at asking for help, and you didn't make me ask. Get yet. She said nothing for a moment. The wagon moved through the spring afternoon, and the mountains held their position to the west, and the road home unrolled ahead of them. I know what you want to ask me, she said, when we get home. He looked at her then. I'm not going to make you do it on the courthouse steps, she said, but I want you to know before we get there, before the children come running out and Margaret appears from somewhere and everything becomes what it becomes, I want you to know what my answer is. He waited. Yes, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the road, but the set of his shoulders changed, some long-held thing releasing, and she felt it beside her the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives, and it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. They drove the rest of the way home in silence that had the quality, for once, of something complete. And in the bottom of her bag, beneath the seat of the wagon, the train ticket sat folded in the dark, still there, still valid, unclaimed. She thought about it once, somewhere on the last mile of road, the mountains large on the horizon ahead and the green coming up at the road's edge. Then she stopped thinking about it. There were children waiting at the end of this road, and a house she had learned the language of, and a man beside her who held her hand without announcement, and a creek that ran through land that was, legally and finally and without question, exactly where it had always been. She did not need the ticket anymore. She had just not known it yet when she bought it. They were home before the children came running. Nora came first, as she always did, because Nora treated waiting as a temporary condition to be endured and then abandoned the moment. Abandoning it was possible. She came out of the front door at a run and across the yard with her hair coming loose from its braid, and she grabbed Evelyn around the middle before Evelyn had finished climbing down from the wagon and held on with the complete physical commitment of a 6-year-old who has been worried for several hours and is releasing all of it at once. Did you win? She asked into Evelyn's coat. We won, Evelyn said. Nora made a sound that was mostly muffled by the coat and then pulled back to look up at her. Is the creek still ours? The creek is still yours. Nora nodded once with the gravity of someone confirming something she'd expected but needed to hear stated plainly. Then she turned to her father and grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the house, as if the matter was settled and there were other things now. Thomas was in the doorway. He looked at Evelyn when she came up the steps, and he didn't say anything right away, just looked at her with those careful dark eyes that had been watching her since October, that had been watching everything since long before October, since the kind of year a 9-year-old boy should not have to have. Then he stepped back to let her in. Fitch did well? He asked. Fitch did his part, she said. We all did our parts. He nodded. He understood what that meant. He was 9, and he had spent 6 months paying attention, and he understood more than people gave him credit for, which was also something she had known since the first morning he'd asked her about Ohio with those 2 careful questions. Clara was in the kitchen. She had made coffee, not because anyone asked, but because she was 12 and she ran this kitchen. And this was what you did when people came home from something difficult. She set a cup in front of Caleb when he came in, and then she looked at Evelyn and said, without preamble and without looking at her directly, Margaret said you found the thing that proved it. I found a letter, Evelyn said. Fitch used it. Clara was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the stove, or at the middle distance somewhere near it. I heard what Billy Marsh's wife said to Mrs. Draper, she said, about you, about why you shouldn't have been allowed to stay. Evelyn set down her bag. She waited. She was wrong, Clara said, still not looking at her directly. I thought, when you first came, I thought she was probably right. Not about the same thing she said, but about, I thought you were going to come here and change everything, and it wasn't going to be... She stopped. She was gripping the edge of the stove with one hand, and the grip was tight. I thought it was going to be wrong, having someone new. I know you did, Evelyn said. It isn't, though. Clara said it like something being admitted under slight duress. Wrong, it isn't. She looked up then, briefly, and what was in her face was the particular complexity of a 12-year-old girl who has kept herself armored for a year and a half and is making a conscious decision to put some of that down. You're not her. You're not my mother, I know that. I know that too. But you're something. She seemed to be working out the right word and not finding it. You're here. You've been here. And I think you should stay. It was not a great declaration. It was a girl of 12 telling the truth in the halting, imprecise way of someone who doesn't have much practice saying the things she actually means, which made it more than any great declaration would have been. Evelyn crossed the kitchen and put her hand on Clara's shoulder. Not an embrace, nothing that would have been too much. Just her hand, steady, and there. I'm staying, she said. That's decided. Clara looked at her hand on her shoulder, then she went back to the stove and adjusted something that didn't need adjusting, and Evelyn went to sit at the table. And the kitchen became a kitchen again, which was its best and most honest function. Caleb asked her that evening. The children were in bed. The house was doing its nighttime settling, beams and boards adjusting to the cold that came in after dark, even in April, even with the days turning warm. The lamp was between them on the table. This was the same table where they had sat in October when she had told him her secret, and he had told her she could stay until spring, and they had both known what that meant, and neither of them had guessed what would come of it. He didn't have a ring. He told her that directly, before he said anything else, that he had thought about it, and hadn't been able to get to the jeweler in Billings before the hearing, and he didn't want to wait longer on the question on account of jewelry. She told him she didn't need a ring. He said that she'd get one eventually, that he intended to do this properly even if the timing was imperfect. She said she didn't have a strong feeling about jewelry. He said he noticed that about her, that she didn't seem to have strong feelings about the things most people had strong feelings about, and then he seemed to realize he'd gone sideways from what he was trying to say, and he stopped and started again. He said, I'm not good at this. I want to be clear about that up front, so you're not expecting something I can't deliver. She said, I know you're not good at it. He said, I'm going to be difficult to live with. I've been told that before, and I don't think it's changed significantly. She said, I've been living with you since October. He said, I'm asking you to keep doing it, permanently. He looked at his hands for a moment, then at her. I'm asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to be not just the wife of this household, but my wife, because I want you here, because this family is better with you in it, and so am I, and I'm aware that I haven't always made that easy to see. She looked at him across the lamp. I already said yes, she said, on the wagon. I know, but I wanted to say it properly. That was properly. Something almost like amusement moved through his expression. That's a low bar. It was honest, she said. That's not a low bar, that's the bar. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He left it there. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen with the lamp between them, in the house that had become her house without her, quite noticing the moment it happened. They were married in May, not because May held any particular significance, but because April had been consumed by the aftermath of the hearing, Fitch sending a formal letter confirming the ruling, the financial threat in Crow's original document dissolving as Fitch had predicted once the water rights were settled, Pete resinking the bridge posts while the ground was soft enough to work. And by the time all of that had settled and the fence line had been checked and the cattle moved to spring grazing, it was May, and the land was green in the way it got in Montana in May, which was not the subtle green of other places, but something emphatic and almost violent after the months of brown and white. Margaret organized most of the wedding, which was not technically what anyone had asked her to do, but was also not a surprise to anyone. She showed up one morning with strong opinions about where the tables should go and whether the food should include her potato salad, to which the answer was yes, because Margaret's potato salad had only one possible correct answer. The ceremony was in the yard, not in a church, not in any formal building, just the yard of the Thornton Ranch on a May morning, with the mountains visible in every direction and the creek running through its rebuilt bridge, and the cattle somewhere out on the spring grass making their low collective sound. A justice of the peace came out from Harlan. There were perhaps 20 people from the valley and the town, which was more than either of them had expected or particularly planned for. Margaret had apparently mentioned it to people, which was Margaret's way of deciding what was appropriate and then making it happen. Evelyn wore her better dress, which was also her only dress that was not a work dress, and she had washed and pressed it the night before, and Clara had, without being asked, mended a small tear at the hem that Evelyn had not yet gotten to. She noticed the mending before she put the dress on, and she stood there holding it for a moment in her room and took a breath, and then she put it on. She did not have flowers. She had not thought about flowers, and there was no one to produce flowers on short notice in Harlan in May, so she carried nothing, which turned out to be fine. Her hands were free. That seemed right for her. Caleb stood at the front of the assembled people in his good jacket, which had been brushed within an inch of its life, and still showed the wear of a working jacket despite all efforts, and he watched her walk across the yard toward him with an expression that was trying to be composed and was not entirely succeeding. He was not a man who showed his face easily. The fact that he was not entirely succeeding at hiding it right now was the most telling thing about him she had ever seen. She stood beside him. Nora, who had positioned herself immediately to Evelyn's left, as if this had been assigned, slipped her hand into Evelyn's during the reading of the vows. Evelyn held it without looking down, without making a thing of it, just holding the small warm hand and saying the words when it was her turn to say them. When it was done, and the justice said the final words, and the people around them made the sounds that people make at weddings, Caleb turned to her and there was a moment, just a moment, where they looked at each other without the audience, just the two of them inside the event and its meaning, and she thought, 6 months ago, I stepped off a train, and you were sitting in a wagon looking at the ground, and neither of us knew what would happen. She thought, I was afraid of everything, and I came anyway. She thought, that is still the truest thing about me, and maybe the best. He kissed her, briefly and without performance, which was exactly right for him, and therefore exactly right. The people around them made more sounds. Margaret made a sound that was suspiciously close to approval. Nora, still holding Evelyn's hand, said loudly, Does this mean she's staying forever? The assembled guests laughed. Caleb said, Yes, Nora. Nora considered this. Okay, she said, with complete satisfaction, as if a negotiation she'd been conducting since October had finally reached its appropriate conclusion. Summer came on fast, as it did in Montana. No gradual warming, just the world deciding 1 week that it was done being anything other than green and hot and loud with insects and birds. The creek ran clear and low. The cattle were fat on the spring grass. Pete fixed the last of the outbuildings that had been on the list since the previous fall, and then started on the fence sections that hadn't been touched in 3 years, working through them with the same unhurried, methodical approach he brought to everything. Thomas got a map of his own, not a book page but an actual map, rolled and somewhat worn, that Fitch had sent along with the legal paperwork. He'd apparently heard from Margaret that the boy liked maps, which was the kind of information Margaret distributed along with her opinions whether you wanted it or not. Thomas pinned it to the wall of his room and spent the first week annotating it with things he'd learned, small notes in his careful handwriting along the river systems. He was not sick again that summer, not once. Evelyn noticed this without saying anything about it, the way she had learned to notice things about this family, quietly, filing them away, not making them carry more weight than they needed to. He had been sick on and off since the previous summer, and then he had been sick through the worst of the winter. And then the bridge had nearly taken him and hadn't, and now he was not sick, and he was filling a map with notes and asking her questions about geography, with an appetite that seemed to grow the more she fed it. She thought about what Fitch had said on the courthouse steps. She thought about it sometimes in the evenings, when the work was done and the house was quiet. She had no illusions about what it meant. She had no education in law, she had no standing, she had found a document in an attic and verified it with a county directory. That was not lawyering. But there was something in the way she had approached the problem, looking for what Crow was afraid of rather than what they needed, that she recognized as a particular way of thinking, and she wondered sometimes what she might have done with it in a different life, or what she might do with it in this one, in whatever form it could take here. She mentioned this to Caleb one evening, not as dissatisfaction, just as a thing she'd been thinking about. He said, "What would that look like?" She said she wasn't sure, that there were people in this valley who needed help with documents and contracts and didn't have the money for lawyers and billings, and that she could read a legal document well enough to explain one, and that Margaret probably knew everyone who had a dispute that needed working through. He said, Margaret knows everything. She said, "That's what I'm counting on." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If that's something you want to do, we'll figure out how you do it." Not, "I'll allow it." Not, "That sounds practical." Just, "We'll figure out how you do it." As if the only question was logistics. As if what she wanted was simply a thing that would now be worked toward. She sat with that for a moment, with the plain astonishment of someone who has spent a long time not being spoken to that way. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me for that," he said. That's what this is." Clara started calling her mom in August. It happened the way most important things in that household happened. Without announcement, without drama, almost as if by accident, though Evelyn suspected there was nothing accidental about it. They were in the kitchen working together the way they often worked now, side by side with the particular comfortable efficiency of two people who have learned each other's habits. And Clara asked her something about the recipe they were working on and addressed the question to Mom without apparently noticing she'd done it. Evelyn went still for just a moment. Clara looked up. Something moved across her face, a quick private assessment of what she'd said and whether she was going to revise it. She held Evelyn's eyes. She did not revise it. "Does the salt go in now or later?" she asked, again, with the same word at the start of it. Evelyn said, "Now, before the flour." Clara nodded and added the salt. They went on working. Nothing was said about it. Nothing needed to be. It was the kind of moment that would have been diminished by acknowledgement, that needed to be received quietly and let sit, the way you let fresh bread sit, because pressing on it too soon tells you nothing about what it will become. That evening, when the children were in bed and Caleb was at the table and the house had gone to its nighttime sounds, Evelyn sat down across from him and said, "Clara called me Mom today." He looked at her. "In the kitchen," she said. "She did it, and then she looked at me and decided she wasn't going to take it back." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face do the careful internal work it did, and then she watched something behind his eyes go soft in a way she almost never saw, a way that he kept banked and private most of the time, that only came out around the children when he thought no one was watching. "Good," he said. His voice was slightly different than usual. "She's going to be all right," Evelyn said, not as reassurance, as statement of fact. "She's going to be more than all right." "I know." He turned his coffee cup on the table. "She's always been more than all right. She needed something to hold while she worked it out." Evelyn nodded. She thought about a 12-year-old girl tying her mother's apron around her waist and managing a household and keeping 3 people fed and clothed and moving forward through grief, holding everything together through sheer stubborn will. She thought about the mending at the hem of her dress. She thought about the glass of water brought to Thomas's room without being asked. "She's going to be remarkable," Evelyn said. Caleb looked at her. "She already is." Victor Crow left the valley before summer ended. This was not a dramatic exit. He did not flee in the night or make any final move that could be called a confrontation. He simply went. Put his property on the market in late July, which surprised most of the valley because even after the hearing loss, people had not expected him to concede so completely and so quickly. The talk in town was that Fitch's note in the record about the good faith of the proceedings had reached other ears, that there were people in Billings who had done business with Crow and were now less inclined to do so. The talk in town was also that Crow was the kind of man who only operated where he had the advantage and left when he didn't, which was perhaps the most honest accounting of him she had heard. Margaret, when told about his departure, said, "Good riddance," with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been right for 2 years and was not going to be gracious about it. The property sold to a family called Barren from further north, a couple with 4 children and the look of people who intended to stay. They came calling in August, which was the custom in that part of the valley, and the Brennan wife brought a pie that was frankly excellent, and her oldest daughter and Clara sat on the porch steps and talked for 2 hours in the way girls that age can go from strangers to something approaching genuine company inside of an afternoon. Evelyn watched this from the kitchen window and thought about what it meant to a 12-year-old girl to have someone her age nearby for the first time in what was probably years. She thought about what it meant to have neighbors who wanted to be neighbors. She thought about October, the train platform, the colorless sky, the man in the wagon looking at the ground. She thought about how much had happened in 11 months and how little of it she could have predicted, and how most of it had happened not because she had planned it correctly, but because she had stayed. That was all. She had stayed and done the work, and told the truth when it was required, and the rest had accumulated the way things accumulate in a real life. Without a clean narrative, without the events happening in the right order, with wrong turns and setbacks and months of uncertainty and one very cold bridge over a very fast creek. She thought, surviving is not the same as living. She had been surviving for a long time before October. She had thought she was living, but she had been managing, keeping herself going, keeping herself intact, not losing anything, but not gaining much either. Living was this. Living was the specific weight of Nora's hand during wedding vows, and Thomas's voice getting stronger every week, and Clara adding salt before the flour, and Caleb saying, "We'll figure out how you do it," as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Living was staying in a place long enough to become part of it. In September, she found the train ticket. She had been reorganizing the small chest of drawers in her room. Their room now, though she still sometimes thought of it as hers from the months it had been only hers. And she had opened the bottom drawer to move some things around. And there it was, in the corner where her traveling bag had been stored since she unpacked it the first week. Still folded. Still technically valid, though the date on it was long past and the railroad would not have honored it. She held it for a moment. She thought about the woman who had bought it. That woman in Ohio who had sold her mother's sewing machine and been terrified on the train and stepped onto the Harlan platform with a secret that felt heavier than everything else she was carrying. That woman who had sat in the wagon next to a man she didn't know and tried to figure out what she was walking into. That woman who had told herself she would prove more than she could argue, and had then spent 11 months doing exactly that, and had been right. She thought, I don't think I knew what I was going to, not really. I thought I was going towards something, but I didn't know its shape. I thought it might be a family, but I didn't know these people, didn't know this land, didn't know what a Montana winter cost or what a Montana spring looked like, or what the sound of a creak through a rebuilt bridge meant when you'd nearly lost a child to it. She thought, you can't know the shape of the thing until you're inside it. She thought, that might be the only true thing there is about starting over. She took the ticket to the kitchen stove. She didn't make a ceremony of it. There was no one watching, and it didn't need ceremony. It just needed doing. She opened the stove door and put the ticket in, and the paper caught immediately, being old and dry, and it was gone in seconds. She closed the stove door and stood there for a moment in the kitchen that smelled like breakfast still and felt like hers. Then she went to find Nora, who had last been seen attempting to negotiate access to Biscuit the horse, whose size and temperament made unsupervised riding an ongoing subject of family discussion. She found her at the fence, 1 foot on the lower rail, making her case to the horse directly. Biscuit, for his part, appeared unmoved. He doesn't understand English, Thomas said, from a few feet away, where he was sitting on the fence rail with a book open on his knees, the map notes version of reading that he did, where the text and the geography in his head were apparently in conversation. He understands when I have apples, Nora said. That's not understanding English. That's understanding apples. It's the same result. Thomas looked at Evelyn over the top of his book. He had the expression of someone who has been having this conversation for an hour and is resigned to it continuing indefinitely. She's going to wear him down eventually, Evelyn said. I know, Thomas said. That's what worries me. She came to lean on the fence next to Nora, and the September morning was warm on her back and the mountains were sharp and blue in the distance, the way they got in September before the first snow came to soften their edges again, and the cattle were somewhere south making their low sounds. And Pete was doing something in the far barn that involved occasional use of a hammer, steady and rhythmic. Nora gave up on the horse and turned to lean her back against the fence instead, looking at the sky with her hair going everywhere as usual. And after a minute, she said, What were you doing in the kitchen? Burning something I didn't need anymore. Nora accepted this without apparent need for further explanation. Can we have hot chocolate tonight? We don't have chocolate. Could we get some? I can ask your father to pick some up next time he goes to town. Nora considered the timeline of this. What if I write it down so he doesn't forget? That's a good idea. You can add it to the list on the shelf. Nora pushed off the fence with the efficiency of someone who has identified the next action and intends to take it immediately. She went toward the house. Walk, Evelyn said, without turning around. Nora slowed to a walk that was nearly a run, which was as much as you were going to get, and Evelyn let it go. Thomas turned a page. The morning went on. Somewhere in the pasture, a bird was doing something noisy that she didn't have a name for yet, some species she hadn't learned. One of the things this country still had to teach her. There were still things it had to teach her. There would be for a long time. She thought that was all right. She thought that was, in fact, the point. Caleb found her at the fence when he came back from checking the south pasture. He rode in from the far side and unsaddled at the barn and came out across the yard and leaned on the fence beside her, and they stood together looking at the land the way they had started to stand together, without needing to say anything about it, without performance. Just two people who have gotten used to each other's presence and find it useful against the size of the world. South fence needs another post before winter, he said. Add it to the list. The list is getting long. Lists on working ranches do that. He looked sideways at her. Thomas told me you burned something in the stove. A piece of paper I didn't need. He was quiet for a moment. He understood what she meant because he knew about the ticket, had known about it since the conversation in March, had never pressed her about it or asked her to get rid of it. That had been, she thought, the right call. It needed to be her decision in her own time, not a thing asked for. Okay, he said. That was all. Just okay. The same word he used for fence posts and cattle counts and weather predictions. The word that meant I've received this information and it goes where it belongs. She had learned to hear what he meant in the words he used, which were often simpler than other men's words but carried more freight. Margaret wants to have us for supper on Friday, he said. All 5 of us? That's what she said. She's apparently got something she wants to discuss about the Brennan family and the grazing boundary on the east side. Evelyn looked at him. She wants to have a land meeting at supper. Margaret holds all her important conversations over food. It gives her control of the pacing. Evelyn thought about this. That's actually very smart. Don't tell her I said so. I wouldn't dream of it. He smiled. Not the almost smile she'd catalogued in the first months, the brief warmth that came and went before it could be clearly seen, but an actual smile, small and crooked and real. She had seen it more often lately. She suspected it had always been there, under everything, waiting for somewhere to land. She turned back to the mountains. This was a thing she had learned about living here. The mountains were different every time you looked at them. Not the mountains themselves, which were as fixed as anything on earth, but what the light did to them, what the season did, what the time of day did. She had spent October looking at them as the shapes of an unfamiliar place. She had spent winter not looking at them much at all, because winter in Montana was a thing you moved through with your head down. She had looked at them in April on the courthouse steps, and they had been the background of a decision that was already made. Now she looked at them in September, and they were simply the mountains, and they were hers in the way that things become yours, not through ownership, but through enough mornings of looking. She thought about a woman who had come a long way from a place where no one needed her anymore, and about what it meant to need and be needed, and about how that was not a romantic notion, but a practical and human one. The core of it, the thing underneath all the other things. We need to matter to someone. We need to be in the right place doing the right thing with the right people. We can survive without it, some of us, for a long time. But that's not living. That's just duration. She thought, I spent a long time with duration. I'm done with duration. She thought, this is living. She thought, it took me 31 years and 2,000 miles and one Montana winter to figure out that the life I wanted wasn't something I was going to be given. It was something I was going to have to build, piece by piece, choice by choice, day by day. A fire rebuilt every morning, a child steadied through a fever, a letter found under other letters in a cold attic, a hand held without announcement on courthouse steps. None of it happened because she was lucky enough. None of it happened because the world owed her anything. It happened because she stayed when it would have been easier to go, and she worked when she could have stepped back, and she told the truth when lying would have been simpler, and she reached across a broken bridge without stopping to think about it because there was a child on the other side and she was the one who was there. That was all, and it turned out that all was enough to build a life on. She turned to Caleb. Tell Margaret Friday is fine, she said. He nodded. And tell her we're bringing the potato salad. He looked at her. She's not going to like that. I know. She pushed off the fence. Her potato salad is better and she'll feel compelled to say so. It'll put her in a good mood. He watched her walk toward the house. She heard him make a sound behind her that was almost a laugh. She went inside. The kitchen smelled like the morning still, like coffee and warm iron from the stove. The list on the shelf had a new entry at the bottom in Nora's laborious 6-year-old handwriting: chocolate. The cat, still named Biscuit, still at complete odds with the horse of the same name, though they had never met and never would, was asleep on the chair by the window in the particular committed way of a cat who has found warmth and intends to defend it. She hung up her coat. She looked around the kitchen, her kitchen, their kitchen, the kitchen of a house she had walked into as a stranger and would leave only if she chose to, which she did not choose to, which she could not imagine choosing to. She thought, this is it. This is the thing. Not perfect. Not without difficulty. Not without the specific ongoing challenges of 3 children at 3 completely different stages of becoming themselves, and a man who was difficult to know and worth knowing, and a piece of land that demanded everything you had and gave it back in forms you didn't always recognize immediately as gifts. Not without winters coming. Not without fence posts and sick cattle and lists that got longer before they got shorter. But real. Genuinely, completely, irreversibly real. She started on supper.